Welcome back to the Winback Academy podcast, where we bring together clinicians, educators, and experts from across the Winback community to explore how rehabilitation, recovery, and performance care are evolving in the real world. I'm your host, Ramona von Leyden, PhD, Senior Director of U.S. Medical Affairs. Today's episode is a part of our Ambassador Spotlight series. Conversations focus less on protocols and more on the people behind the practice, the experiences that shape them, the lessons they've learned, and the philosophies that continue to drive their work. Today, I'm joined by Mark Shires, Winback's sports ambassador, who's an athletic trainer and sports medicine clinician. Mark spent years working in professional baseball, including with the Orioles, and brings a unique perspective on athlete recovery, performance culture, return to play, and the evolution of modern sports medicine. In this conversation, we talk about what it's really like working in elite sports environments, how recovery philosophy has changed over the years, the human side of athlete care, and where sports medicine and performance are heading next. Here's my conversation with Mark. Welcome back to the Winback Academy podcast. Today's episode is part of our Ambassador Spotlight series. These are conversations with the clinicians, educators, and experts who make up the Winback community. These conversations are less about protocols and more about the people, their stories, experiences, philosophies, and what continues to inspire them in their clinical practice. Today, I'm joined by Mark Shires, athletic trainer, sports medicine clinician, and one of our Winback sports ambassadors. Mark has spent years working in elite sports environments, including with the Orioles, and he brings a tremendous perspective on recovery, performance, and athletic care. Mark, thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's an awesome pleasure to sit and talk about what I've spent my entire life doing.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a perfect segue into how I thought we could start this call today. How did you first get into athletic training and sports medicine?
So I always tell people I had a real I had an athletic trainer in high school. There was no impact story. There was no injury. Like most people, I was going into computers. I'm of that vintage where computers were just getting big, and I took a college level computer course in high school, and I went, no way. And I opened up a course catalog, and it said sports medicine. I said, wow, that's cool. And so I kind of jumped in with both feet. I got an opportunity to, when I was looking at colleges, got into a athletic training program as a freshman, which usually wasn't a way to get in. Usually you had to fight your way in once you got to college, and kind of just worked my way from there. And so I don't have that cool origin story where I got injured and somebody helped me out. Where I did have an athletic trainer that I knew, but I actually really didn't put two and two together until I started actually in the program, kind of realizing what it was. And so, yeah,
that's interesting. I think that's actually, I think that's actually a story that's pretty relatable, is that sometimes the way that you find your path is actually by trying something that you think you're going to like, and it actually turns out that it's not the right path for you.
yeah.
So I kind of get that. Yeah. I mean, you're like, oh yeah, computer seems cool. Obviously that's the direction that things are going. And then you realize, yeah, this is not got my interest at all. What were your sports when you were growing up?
Baseball. Baseball was number one.
Always baseball. Okay.
That's why I gravitated towards it. Basketball. My mom was a physical educator, so I played everything at home. My parents made me do everything from, not competitively, but we played tennis, we played, badminton, we played, anything that, it was a ball or a bat or so forth. We did at home. And it's funny. My wife's also an athletic trainer, an educator, and my son is the same way. I mean, he doesn't sit down. And when he's not sitting down, it's a ball or a bat or a racket or whatever's in his hand. And, we built a basement. I thought maybe it might be a man cave. Nope. It is a amusement park for an 11-year-old. So So yeah, so
Ball, like, yeah, ball is life. Ball is life.
yes, it is. It is. And like I said, with a family that's both athletic trainers, that my son has spent a good part of his life on sidelines, or or dugouts, or so forth. So, I'm sure that he's, you know, full in on whatever sport that we're in, or so forth. And so he's the best cheerleader. And if he may have a minor in athletic training already at this point in time at 11.
Wow. Okay. So to kind of steer back to this, so you got into it in the college program, you had your experience there. What is the process from kind of going through those training programs to finding your way to a team? Like how did you end up what's the path that eventually led you to working with the Orioles for such a long time?
So I think with all sports, it's you need to start. You need to start with where you want to go. You got to begin with the end in mind, right? For me, I it just happened to be when I was a junior in high school, the Orioles actually put a minor league affiliate basically in my backyard, within 3-4 miles of my house, where I grew up. And so I, when I knew I was getting into athletic training, I just started um, pestering the staff with the minor league team. Hey, do you guys have internships? I'm going into athletic training. Can you hook me up? Blah blah blah. And just happened to be I worked at a restaurant, actually a deli, right next to the stadium. And the
Oh, that's
athletic
awesome.
trainer with the team came in. I met him. His name is Mitch Bibb, one of the first people that really kind of impacted me. He took a chance and said, come on, come in, help me out. And so I spent parts of 3 summers working with him. It was the Bowie Bay Sox. I worked with him for 3 summers. Volunteer. I charted the hours. I was somewhere in the range of 1,000, 1,200 hours each summer that I spent with him, because at that point in time you had to get a certain amount. Those ended up not counting towards my education, but it was what prepared me for what I was going to do in the future. And
Nice.
so, as I tell students, when like I said, my wife's an athletic trainer, she's an educator. When her students will ask me, like, what, same type of question, what is it? And it's preparing yourself for what you want to do. And it's tough. I was lucky. I knew in high school that I wanted to do sports medicine. I knew in college I wanted to work baseball. So I've always kind of had that 2 steps ahead. I was lucky enough to always be kind of 2 steps ahead, knowing what I wanted to do early, and then just being able to then put myself in that position. And so I always tell students, like, if you want to work in the SEC, whether it's football, basketball, baseball, you need to at least either work in the SEC for some other sport, or you need to work in some other high level baseball to then get to that point. It's just easier. Like, you know, somebody that works at a Division 3 college. I'm not saying that they're not prepared like anybody else would be, but you're going to get that leg up when it comes to the interview process, right? If
Sure.
if I'm looking at an interviewee and I see they have got professional baseball experience and I'm hiring for professional baseball, yes, they're going to go to the top of the list. So it's not about knowing somebody, but it's about putting yourself in the best position to then keep moving up that ladder.
Building. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think, okay, so two questions. One, so I'm going to assume that you were an Orioles fan.
You know what? I'm a baseball fan.
Okay,
My dad,
okay.
my dad was military. We lived on both coasts. I grew up in the time of the Bash Brothers, and when Oakland was
Okay.
really good in the late '80s. We had season tickets to Oakland. Like,
Oh, you and me both, man. Oakland was my team.
yeah,
I'm a Sacramento girl, so we didn't, we had the River Cats, which were the
hmm
Oakland feeder team, and yeah,
well,
I
that's where
mean,
they're playing now. They're playing in
yeah,
Sacramento and in that stadium. And so, but yeah, like, I mean, it's funny. Like, I going back to the Coliseum, whatever it is called now, the Oakland Coliseum before they moved to Sacramento. I remember sitting in the seats in where we were at. We had second deck right behind home plate. And I remember sitting in those seats and looking down at that field and saying, I'm going to be there one day. I want to be watching a game from that dugout. And when we finally got to Oakland, it was kind of that surreal moment of,
Oh, wow.
okay, that's where that was the that was the I made it moment, because at that point in time it was, the 10-year-old, 12-year-old Mark is now getting to be where he wanted to be. And so that kind
That's
of,
super cool.
that's where, they finally came full circle. So
Yeah.
go back to the original question. Yeah, I mean, with the Orioles, yeah, I mean, after we moved back, I was playing myself. Like, I wouldn't say I was a baseball fan. I wouldn't say I was a fan of a team per
Okay.
se, other than those years. Like, I watched baseball. If it was on, I'd watch it. Probably once we moved, I really didn't like, the affiliation wasn't there. We went to some more. I went to
Yeah.
some Orioles games. They just moved into Camden Yards at that point in time. I like it was there, but it wasn't. I always tell my son, like, because you get, my son's 11 now, so kind of as he was young, yeah, the son, your son always wants to kind of stick the knife in you a little bit. Oh, hey, Dad, I think I'm going to be a Yankees fan. Okay, but you can't live
Yeah,
here. You
yeah,
can't live here though.
yeah.
And but the ultimate response that I told him is AJ, whoever pays the bills. Right now, in this point in your life, you can be a fan of a team, but you have to understand that if dad goes somewhere else or things change or so forth, it's whoever pays the bills. You have to understand,
Yeah.
like, it's that life in sports changes, because you may have an affiliation, and you may be a fan of, like I said, I love being in the Coliseum. Did I want to see Oakland win? Now, at that point in time, like, it's,
Sure, sure, sure.
you almost you get calloused a little bit. Like,
This
another,
is a yeah. So this is a good point that when you're in that professional sports space, that there's probably you do develop that callus because you might
mm-hmm,
be working with different teams. Your
yeah,
affiliations are going to change. So let me then shift us a little bit to the actual work, which is regardless of who your team
sure,
is, you're working with the athletes. Like that's really
yes,
who you
yes.
care about, right? So what do you love most about getting to work with athletes?
With athletes, I always said, like, yeah, I never wanted to have to sell somebody on getting healthy, right? That's, you know, if you take that portion out of the equation, it makes being a clinician so much better, so much easier. And 99 out of 100 guys, they want to get healthy. They want to be back on the field. They want to get, back in the fight, and that's where they want to be there almost immediately. And so that's what, the nicest thing about working with elite athletes is you typically don't see that individual that wants to pump the brakes. They want to push
Right.
you, so I need to push them. And most of the times it's, sorry, I don't need to push them. I am the one who needs to pump the brakes on them, and and make sure that we're doing everything in an appropriate time frame.
Right.
One of the big,
They are motivated to get back on the field. You're not having to convince them to do their exercises. If anything, you're having to convince them to do recovery.
right, right.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny, in this day and age, recovery is definitely not something that you have to convince anybody
Not
of.
anymore. Yeah.
I really think, I always say that when CrossFit hit, it really changed the sports medicine world, because there was a lot of factors that kind of all hit at the same time. There was a lot of research, especially in base, and I'm talking in my small baseball world. But there was a lot of research that came out that, um, about injuries and what type of pitches and so forth, and that, so there was a lot of pitchers that were pushing themselves harder. It used to be, it was the marathon, not the sprint, right? You wanted to throw 7 innings, 100, 120 pitches. and you wanted to save a little bit in the tank to then get later in the game. Well, statistics show that the third time through the order, which is typically about the fifth or sixth inning, the starting pitcher loses effectiveness. So the idea was we're going to go harder earlier, and you're going to be done after 5 innings. Number one, and
Right.
then like I said, the CrossFit idea of go until you puke and then recover so that you can do it again the next day, I think really informed the sports medicine on the backside of that, because everybody took those lessons that they were learning from CrossFit of we're going to go as hard as we can, and then we're going to recover as hard as we can so that we can go as hard as we can the next day. And it was funny how you would see products that would come out in the CrossFit that was kind of really targeted towards CrossFit would then start making its way into the athletic training room so that the athletes could
Okay.
recover. And I really think that CrossFit really drove the recovery market, because that was recovery really became that buzzword 10, 12 years ago, just as you started to see CrossFit games on TV.
Yeah.
So you saw the proliferation of CrossFit gyms in your town. Like I really I would love to do a study, a look at where everything kind of hit and what the timing was. Just because, like I said, you saw all of those individuals, you saw those companies, those businesses started marketing towards recovery, and that's where.
This is wow. This is fascinating, Mark. I don't think I've ever heard somebody kind of pitch it that way, but that is so
Mhm.
interesting because you're right. There was, I mean, and I'll be honest, to me, I think there was, in the sort of the like weekend warrior athletes, the non-professional athletes, people who
Right,
are pushing themselves harder than they really should have been. But
right,
then that meant that forced them to have recovery that they weren't considering previously. Like, oh, if you were somebody who, maybe lifted weights a few times a week, or maybe you went for runs every day, but like you weren't pushing the way the CrossFit games are, the road games, these really
right,
difficult hybrid athlete competitions. Now it's the Hyroxes and the Apexes and all
right.
of those. Like it wasn't as immediate a need. I mean, and obviously you saw I would say that in the beginning there was some negative fallout from that, right? With CrossFit athletes who were getting
Of course,
rhabdo and things that were really serious. But then it's like, well, if you actually take care of your body, then you can push it that hard. And we know that from
right.
like the military, we know that from professional sports. It's just getting it into the training room. So I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that kind of like CrossFit had this impact on pro sports that
Yeah.
actually impacted recovery. So, as an AT, as you see that shift happening, how do you start to incorporate that? How do you start thinking about that in a way that you present it to your athletes as well?
It's it's funny because you think it's the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth, right? What is everybody talking about now? You talk about the conjunctive therapy, and all the stuff that supports recovery right now. But everybody, it's swinging back to sleep, nutrition, right? It's that that's what we had before the recovery hit the market, and kind of going back to that idea. I think the other thing is the market then became there wasn't a reach for John Q. Public to buy a recovery device, right? That was also what hit at the same time. But telling our athletes like, hey, you, yet again, it's another funny thing where things hit. Like, I was in baseball for 27 years. I saw the hard drinking, the hard living players early in my
Mm-hmm.
career, and then it swung towards guys didn't even go out after games. They went back to the room and they played video games. And
That's actually I was going to ask you about that. So do you think that there's been a shift in the field where, yeah, I think when I was, we're roughly the same age, I think. And when you're a kid, you heard about pro athletes and these partying,
Mhm.
the guys going out, getting in trouble, blah, blah. Do you think that that started to, and maybe that's partial, of course, we could go down a whole rabbit hole of like social
Mhm.
media and how that impacts the, visibility of a
Yeah,
player.
definitely.
But for players, do you think as we understand better about recovery, as we understand about how they approach this, is there a mental side that these athletes are starting to internalize, and how do you kind of manage that with your athletes? Because ultimately, you're the person that they trust to get them back
Sure.
out on the field.
Um, you know, it's showing, first off, it's showing that you care, right? Immediately is where you get to that point. Like, um, is building that culture. And, the Orioles did a great job building that culture for years. It was, you know, getting a group of young men that had basically had their own culture to begin with. Like, you know, those guys were, I always tell, people always ask, oh, what are those guys like? And my response always is I would let my son at 7, 8, 9, 10, while he was, hanging around in the clubhouse, was I would have let my son go hang out with any of those kids, any of those players at any point in time. If they said, "Hey, Mark, I'm going to take him out on the field. We're going to go get ground balls." Hey, Mark, hey, not that it would be a situation. Hey, you want to go out? I'll hang out with your son. Like, there wasn't a single guy on that team with that culture that I wouldn't have said, yeah, go ahead, do it. Like,
Oh,
pure,
cool.
wonderful, wonderful, wonderful men. Like, watching those guys grow up in the professional level, those guys are a bunch of unbelievably wonderful individuals. And so, like, at that point in time, the mental, like, I didn't have to provide a lot of mental support, except more in the injury realm, right? It's, the nice thing was is those guys were well-adjusted young men that my job was to augment and support their quest for quest to return from injury, their, to keep them moving along. I don't want to say straight and narrow, because they were straight and narrow kids, but the path towards return to play. And my job is to, like I said earlier, is to pace them, right? Whether or not, it's to push them at times, which, yet again, it's not usually pushing them. It's usually trying to rein them in. It's trying to
Yeah. So
instill.
how do you manage them if they're trying to return too quickly?
So my rule always was, we need to evaluate how you feel today, how you feel tomorrow, because you can feel great after you do everything and you want to do more, but let's see how you feel tomorrow. And it's the, Laura Ramus talks about, the making of the soup, right? How many, what seasonings are we going to put in? And if we took too many seasonings in, do we know what screwed up our soup, right? And so it's the same. It's the same theory with these guys. I need them to buy into, today we are going to hit. Tomorrow we are going to recover, and then the next day we are going to throw, as a example. Because if I do throw and hit on the same day, I don't, and they come in more sore the next day, I don't know
Hmm.
what the issue is. And so I need them to understand that, whether I have to, pull out a piece of paper and draw bar graphs of, a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, a little bit more as we go forward. And I think, you know, getting them to understand that the idea of this is our end goal right here. How are we going to stair step our way up to that end goal? The toughest thing I think that people don't understand, and even sometimes, even people that are inside, is progression, right? We all need to understand what progression is. Whether it's
Absolutely.
in rehab, it's just the simple idea of progression is going from, 3 pounds to 4 pounds to 5 pounds. That's the simple part. Then we're going to add in, what other variables do we want to add? Is it a stable surface? Is it unstable surface? Do they have their eyes open? Do they have their eyes closed? Is it known? Are we going to start, adding in proprioception, where we push them around? Are we going to add in all these additional factors to then get them to the end goal? And so, that's where you start with the, hey, we're going to do, this, and it's making that soup, but it's measured ingredients as we make our way along. And the important thing I think, is to show them a larger picture of it so that they understand the idea of we're trying to build here. And, one of the big things about, recovery is injury recovery, injury rehab is there's that fine line where rehab ends and then performance begins because
Mm-hmm.
a lot of rehab forgets that there's another level to rehab. You finish your rehab, okay, well, he's healthy, great, he's healthy, but to start a major league season, you've got 45 days of spring training to get yourself
Right.
ready for that competitive season. So where are we at in that continuum of, were they injured? So my rule of thumb always was there's about for the first 2 weeks, you got about a 1-to-1 ratio, right? If you're maybe even less than a 1-to-1 ratio, if you're injured for, 5, 7 days, you're on the 10-day injured list, right? If it takes us 5 days to get you back to taking batting practice, getting ready for the game, 5 days of return to play activity is probably where you need to go. About a 1-to-1 ratio. Maybe, if you're in that 10-day period, you might be able to play with it a little bit because they're not deconditioned, right? Everybody talks
Right.
about the acute to chronic workload ratio. It's conditioning, deconditioning, right? Is what we're thinking about. And then the amount of load that we're putting on them. But then once you get after about 2 weeks, that ratio starts to increase. If they're down for 2 weeks, you might need 3 weeks to get back. If they're down for 4 weeks, they may need 6 to 8 weeks to get back, right? And I'm saying, when I say down, I mean like they're not participating in any baseball activity, and where are we going to build up and so forth. And sometimes, that gets lost in the shuffle because of the need to get them back to the competitive season. You talk about right now, Tommy John surgery is, return to activity, right? Is return to pitching is usually 12 to 16 months. But everybody then talks about, well, they're not 100% till 2 years out of surgery. There you go. That performance window everybody forgets about, right? You get a surgery, you're back at 12 months, 16 months, whatever. But well, they're not they're not they're a shell of themselves. Well, yeah, because they're not back. They haven't then built up that capacity. We've tried to do it as
Right.
best we can in rehab, but you can never recreate that performance window to then get them ready to pitch, right? You can put them on, you can send them out on rehab. The adrenaline doesn't hit throwing in a AA game in Bowie, Maryland, as much as it does throwing under the candle watts, of the lights in Camden Yards. There's no comparison. You can't build that up no matter what. So you've got those rehab games, but then you have those performance games. And a lot of the research, especially in Tommy John and the UCL repairs, reconstructions, and so forth, is okay, how long does it take to return to play? But then the biggest metric that you're starting to see in a lot of the research is the return to previous level, right? Because
Right. Not return to play, but return to performance.
right, return to performance. And the best way to
Yeah.
do it is return to previous level or above, right? Because you get a guy who's in
Yeah.
AAA. Can they get back to AAA? Can they get back to the big, can they then get to the big leagues? Can that big leaguer get back to the big leagues? And then what is that time frame compared to,
That's okay. So you said, because I know, and you're an educator and you're very up to speed on research. I love what you send me, papers that I haven't found. It's great. What do you think in terms of what we know now about that difference between return to play and return to performance? What are, as a clinician like yourself understanding now that maybe you weren't 10 to 15 years ago? How does that change the way you talk to your athlete about it? Does that, I mean, you've kind of alluded to this with like the progression that you've got,
sure,
but like how, because that I think as a professional athlete, and I think honestly, as any of us, most of the Winback team, we were all competitive athletes in some regard. And it's really hard sometimes because, as a kid and when you're playing these sports when you're young and you haven't had a major injury, you're like, yeah, I just practice more. I practice harder. That's going to get me there. And then sometimes, as you said, it's nope, you got to slow down. It's less is more. It's the progression. And that's a really hard thing for an athlete to wrap their head around at first because it just doesn't click with everything they've learned about training.
It is. And you know what? It yet again, having an 11-year-old, you realize that, what does everybody talk about with, with apps and so forth, right? You just have to gamify it. You have to gamify things I think to help with that competitive juices, those competitive juices. I had a pitcher years ago, Oliver Drake. He was a I say special individual in that he was a competitor, right? And so what he did is, we would throttle him on how hard he threw, right? You can't throw too hard in your bullpen in your return to play progression because we want, 75%, 80%, 90%. And now truly we are sitting out there with a radar gun, making sure that they don't hit certain things.
Okay.
But what we did, well, the way we gamified it though, was how many, like, we put up, they had the ability, we just have a strike zone that's built out of just thread, a real light um, uh, rope, twine that goes around, gives us the strike zone. So instead of him worrying about velocity and getting to that, what he did is he went out, he would try and throw X amount of strikes, X percentage amount of strikes in what he had. So what he did is he gamified it himself. So instead of saying, "Hey, I'm going to try and hit a number on velocity," he said, "I'm going to try and throw 75% strikes today." Right. And
Right.
so
Right. Okay.
so it was getting that gamify ability for him to then say, I'm going to do better the next day. I'm going to do better the next day. I'm going to do better the next day, and build upon that to
Right.
try and get something out of it, because he wasn't getting what, the full, full adrenaline rush of trying to throw as hard as he can. But so, hey, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do what I can control today, which is throwing it in that box.
Right. So this leads me actually, it's a nice moment, a segue to kind of move us into what, within the last 10, 15 years, you mentioned gamification. So that leads into objective metrics,
Mm-hmm.
wearables, all of these things that have become all of a sudden athletes and clinicians have a lot more data than you used to have. And it's like you have, 24 hours a day data. You have data on them when they're sleeping, you have data on them when
Mm-hmm.
they are recovering. And then of course that plays into modalities, which will be kind of like the last chunk we get into, because I, obviously
Sure.
want to chat about Winback and what you're doing with us here. But how do you think, do you think having all these objective measures allows you a bit more, it's an easier sell to kind of gamify it. It's an easier sell to show them the data that like, here's what you looked like yesterday, here's what you look like today, here's your sleep scores. Or is it, I sometimes waffle on this because sometimes I think it's a little bit like sometimes the data can be too much. So
Yes,
yeah.
it's a double-edged sword, and the thing is that um as a clinician, I also know where my role is. Like, I think I'm okay with, playing at, not at a professional level, but I've always been playing baseball. I've always been interested in the intricacies of mechanics, right? But
Mhm.
I'm a body mechanic. I'm not a pitching mechanics guy. And so, that's where you have to rely on your pitching coaches in baseball and so forth, and to have that dialogue, and then understand where they're coming from, what they want, and then what we want in the rehab progression, and then kind of meshing that. It's important that we then mesh, you know, what they want, and that's where, mechanics, spin rates, velocity, and so forth. That's where those things kind of come into play. And then the double-edged sword is, you know, you watch a major league game, and they have an iPad. The bat's over. You sit them on the bench, see them on the bench, and they're looking. Maybe they may not even be lifting their head up to actually watch the game, but they're watching their last at bat,
Right.
right? And we
Yeah.
know in teaching of skill and so forth that trying to then address skill within the moment doesn't work. And so that's where that double-edged sword is, you have a guy who throws a bullpen and he goes, and then we're talking, especially when you get to like, you're close to end term rehab as they're getting into performance, right? They're thinking about those metrics. They're thinking about, what is my fastball spin rate? And then the thing is they go, you got the coach back here with an iPad. Every pitch they throw, what was the spin rate on that? What was,
Yeah.
and what's the axis? How's it moving and so forth? And the thing is that the game has changed, 10 years ago when we started being able to really, really look at these metrics and so forth. And there's a need for that, but sometimes there needs to be a feel for it, right? Hey, not a suboptimal pitch, we need to think about trying to do A, B, and C instead of going at raw numbers, because the problem is they get caught up in the raw numbers as
Right.
opposed to saying, hey, suboptimal, you know, I need the axis turned a little bit, your hands a little bit outside. Let's get the feel of that. How are we going to get the feel of that to change the axis of the ball spinning, right?
This is interesting because I think that this gets to something about sports in general, that the numbers take away the fact that sports are an art, right? It's a
mm,
skill. Like skill is not something that really can be tied to a number. You can't build up your skill by a number. It's the skill is that it's the nuance. It's okay if you're not spinning enough. What's the change in the shape of how your wrist is moving? What's your foot positioning? All these things that like you as the athlete, or you as the coach, or you as the AT, like you've learned this over time. Like that's what makes you the expert in it. But sometimes the
right,
numbers can get in the way of that because it's like, oh well, because I've had kind of the opposite where you see someone and maybe they've just thrown a handful of really fantastic pitches, but then they look at the numbers and it's not what they were aiming for. And then they're like,
right,
oh, I screwed it up. And it's like, those pitches were great. Sometimes just
right,
put the numbers away.
right,
So
right.
it's
And
an
it,
interesting balance.
it's pitching to the video game scoreboard, right? It's not,
Yeah.
it's results, right? And I think, you know, you see that, you see those blips, those guys are, that are, I don't, they're not, there are unicorn because of their results, but not because of their numbers, right?
Right.
And so the funny thing is now, there's a pitcher right now for Minnesota that's he's 5-2, and he's not, he's throwing low 90s, right? And everybody's, oh, what's, he harkens back to, what pitchers used to be like, right? And the thing is, yeah, he's getting outs, right? That's the number that counts, is getting outs, not, I
Right.
remember, kind of in the infancy of spin rate and so forth. We had a young man who was, oh, he's got elite spin on his changeup, right? Got a 9 ERA in A ball, right? Like, things aren't meshing somewhere here, right?
Right.
So, okay, we can chase something up to a point, but when, it's return on investment, right? When that return isn't kind of hitting what our investment is and what we're seeing, at some point you got to, it's, you got to, trim the sails and start going a different way, right? It's a, the numbers are great, but between the lines and when the lights are on, that's a different story. And sometimes those things translate, and other times they don't translate at all. So
Yeah.
it's
The numbers are their information. They're not
right.
the final, right?
Right.
So yeah, I hear that for sure. Let's shift gears a little bit because I want to move a
Sure.
little bit more speaking, as it was said, with technology to go away from sort of the outcome measures and the numbers and talk about modalities, because obviously that's something that you do with us.
Sure.
Winback, of course, we make a modality, we make our Takar and EMS device. So for you, modalities have they've trended up and down in the
Of
the
course.
the sports medicine and sort of all rehab and recovery space. And that I think probably over the last 20 years, there was a while where people were really shying away from them. And now in the last like 10 years or so, I think we're seeing a big swing back up, including what we're
Hmm.
seeing with Takar and EMS and light therapy and just energetic modalities, especially. So I know at the Orioles, before you came to join our team, you worked with Winback, and I'd love to hear a little bit about how you sort of first discovered Winback and like what stood out to you on the clinical level in using that modality with your athletes.
Sure. So the kind of the funny moment was, so I was working for an iStim, working with hot grips with iStim, and um, Frank who owns Hot Grip is a just funny story. I met him at a conference, and his brother was in my fraternity in college, and it was just one of those things. It was like, oh, I know who you are because you look exactly like your brother. So we developed a relationship, and so we were messing around. I was messing around, we did some work with him, doing some education, and so I just decided one day I was going to put a stim pad on a player, and I put a stim pad on a hot grips tool, and I
Okay.
started treating, and I started putting that electrical current through the hot grips tool, through the patient, back, of course, to the return that was on the patient. And I reached out to Frank and I said, "Hey, Frank," I said, "Hey, I got this idea for you. Like, just started messing around, and here's a video of it, and so forth." And he goes, "Oh, that's really cool. I've got this company you need to talk to." And so
Oh,
that's where he introduced myself to Winback in 2017, 2018. And so that's where that was then we started we trialed a win back unit 2018 in the big leagues, and then I think by the end of the year we purchased the unit. I'm not sure. I think if we weren't the first team in the U.S., first sports team in the U.S., we were the first major league team, Major League Baseball team with the unit in the U.S. And so that really informed. That was really how we started. Kind of my relationship with Winback as a company um, was just because of a light bulb moment that went into a connection that then went into the deeper dive into this newer modality, and for me it started out with, okay, I can do something different that I haven't been able to do with anything else, right? I can put my hands on a patient and treat at the same time. My uh, modalities course in college, where the first thing that we talked about every day in modalities was using your hands, right? Most important thing that you can do in a treatment modality is being able to use your hands. So the win back check boxes for me immediately because I
right.
could use my hands in a treatment so that I wasn't sitting there, ironing clothes, using it, putting an ultrasound head on somebody and just hoping and praying that whatever was happening underneath was making a change. And so then I got deeper into it, right? The idea of I can treat and then bracket my iStim treatment with Winback in the middle of it. Or excuse me, with iStim in the middle of it with Winback bracketing my treatment. That I can then go to the next step, which is that progression of including a modality with exercise, right? I think the biggest issue in that swing that you were talking about of modalities is we forget that modalities are important, but so is exercise, right? You look at a lot
Right.
of the research and the conjunctive therapy where you take TCAR and you know exercise, or TCAR alone, exercise alone. The dual therapy is typically always wins out, right? And so being able to take that modality that I can then use and with my exercise protocol is that sweet spot that I just really didn't hit with anything else. Like you're not going to do an ultrasound, you're not going to do stim. I was doing a little bit of eye stim, but what I found was as soon as I put the Winback on and treated with it, those results multiplied. And so being able to really now push in this in the educational program the idea of let's treat and let's exercise together is so
Mm-hmm.
important to me that um, I just like everything else pales in comparison. Like there's no other like
Yeah,
there's no other modality that you can really do that with.
yeah, I agree with you. There's definitely, it's interesting because we go into these clinics and are talking to people who are thinking about, getting win back units and thinking about how to implement it. And I have this one clinic in my head that I'm thinking of where you walk in and they've got their red light panel and they've got their whole setup and it's like this corner of their modalities, which that like they do their exercises and they do their work with their patients and then they bring them over to the modality and they set them up and they kind of leave them there and they walk away. And it's very passive. And I think we know movement is medicine, and so it's very logical to say if you can move while using these modalities that allow for tissue to tissue pliability and for you
Mm-hmm.
to increase vascularization and oxygenate the cells. I mean, this is kind of the BFR mantra as well,
Sure.
right? When you use BFR, you don't just have them sit there and cut off their circulation. It's you're moving through squats, you're moving through this, and you're getting that blood flow and you're getting that pumping. And if we can enhance that, then it's going to lead to a better outcome long term, which kind of ties back into we're going to be able to recover with the goal of performance, not the goal of getting back to play. And it's just the end goal and the metric to get there can change and shift. I would love to hear from you because you did, as you just alluded to, you were one of the first teams, if not the first team, to have Winback back in 2018. Our devices have changed quite a bit since 2018. I'd love to hear because I think that a big part of that is that Winback as a company, we're very focused on innovation, and we want to make sure that we are seeing what's coming down the line of what we know about how to recover. And so you've probably seen Winback go from something that was being used more where somebody's getting treated versus
Right.
now it's more of a hey, we're treating you, but you're moving, but you're doing these exercises. So especially, in the last year, as we give the context that you've come on to help us train and get other sports teams up to speed on what we're doing, for you as you've gotten up to speed on the newer units, what kind of stood out to you that you were like, oh, this is such a great, or not, but like,
Sure.
how have you seen things go where you're like, oh, that's it, that's what we were talking about, that's that piece.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the Care Plus programs on the unit are, extremely there's the thought that's been put into the Care Plus programs, and then the usage, right? We're using, um, I that's the thing, and I really applaud what you've done now with with the uh, with the with the Winback educational component, because being an original user, like we had Frank come in, um, excuse me, Fred, come in,
Fred,
and
yeah.
then
Frank's the other
uh,
guy.
yeah, and then doing all the initial education, and because the thing is when you first get the unit, you're drinking out of a fire hose, right? It's a brand new
Oh my God.
modality that I've
Yeah.
got no idea what to do, and I take it and I rub my mouse right on where does it hurt, right? And so that's what you start with, right? You start with what you know and what is comfortable, and then pushing yourself to get um, out of your comfort zone. Then the great thing is the continual education. We had three in person um, educational events on trying to continue to progress our knowledge with Winback, right? And like I said, number one was drinking out of a fire hose. It was, oh my god, I don't know what I'm doing, right?
Yeah.
And then going to the step and the next step and the next step, and now seeing it from the other side and seeing the push now, and that's where I hope that I can help the next clinician that then sits down to the Winback and says, okay, why don't I'm just doing this, I'm just ironing the skin with the CET or the RET, And it's like,
Right.
no, there's so much more that you could do. And going in and using the the guided programs, I think is a great first step that I didn't have when I first started using the machine, because it was that the programming wasn't in there. And then, being you know, a strong-headed clinician, it was like, well, I know what I'm doing. And so
Right.
then now, like, you know, taking those few steps back and saying, I need to get better at what I'm doing. And, the educational component became such a big push for me. And like I said, now that's my kind of drive. And that's where I want to fit in now in the Winback world, is saying, hey, you old heads that, think that you know everything, let's talk some more, because I was right there. Like, I know what it was like, starting out and drinking from the fire hose and not conceptualizing all these things. How can I help? How can we how can we make you a better clinician while using this machine? And how can we support you
Yeah.
by, using the um, using the program, using the Care Plus? How can we do that? And then now pushing myself, like, I had a great conversation with one of our one of the teams we were educating, and I was, we you and I haven't had a chance to sit down and talk about this, but, like, I think one of the things that I would really push is using the pelvic program for core injuries. Right?
Mm.
It's one of the
So this is you led right into what I was going to say. I think because myself as well, I think Winback and not just Winback, to be honest with you, a lot of modalities are now realizing like modalities that used to be sort of framed as like you can do this one thing, this one with this modality, and now
right,
no, there's a lot more versatility, and it's the clinician magician, right? It's the clinician who's like, okay, I know what this modality is. How do I incorporate that into all my treatments? And it becomes much broader, much more versatile. But that's also the challenge: is how do you understand all of the things that you could possibly do
right,
with this technology? And the Care Plus programs, as you said, I'm fascinated on our Ask Me Anything calls, especially Don. Don does such a great job where when he presents things, he'll be talking about, let's say he's talking about back pain, and then he's like, well, I'm using the Care Plus Slim Plus or Pelvic Plus, which you hear that name and you don't initially think, oh, how would this help treat low back pain? But it's
right,
like, well, where is the actual issue stemming from? And so when
right,
you mention that with like using the pelvic program for core, then it's getting more into like, what is the core? What are we actually dealing with in
right,
these athletes? Because many athletes have pelvic problems, which they have never been taught to address. And even as a clinician, that's not usually taught to address.
right,
So understanding like that the programs are like a starting off point to, that can be varied and changed to the needs of the patient is such a huge part of the education process. And it's the most challenging part because there's so many things you can do, but it's
right,
also the most exciting part because then when you start to build it in, into these plans for treatment that get really elegant and you're like, whoa, that's so cool that you're using that program for this way. And it's like, oh, because you're combining the EMS and you're combining the high tens and you're combining the tech art in such a way that it's going to create this outcome, even if it doesn't, wouldn't have necessarily been what you traditionally thought it would be.
right,
So yeah, it's definitely, I mean, that's to us, I think all of this always revolves around education. And I think there's perhaps now we're used to a lot of times in the world when you get something that it's like a plug and play, it's just, oh, you plug it in and you hit it and it goes. But as a clinician, that's never going to be the case. The clinician is always the person. It's you are the magic, you're the person behind it, and the
hmm
technology is just there to support it, to support your
right,
treatment plan.
right. Yeah, and yeah, it's definitely, it's the art and the science behind it. And it was one of those, like I said, you get those, if you don't if I think part of education, especially right now in the sports medicine realm, you there's so much dictatorial information coming out versus there's not a lot of that, free flow integration of knowledge, right? You know, you take a course, especially like especially in manual therapy, right? Okay, you have to put your hand here. You have to turn your
Hmm.
hand in a certain manner so that you take the force out of the tissue, and then you have to move the tissue or the segment in this particular way to get your results. And we see it. I see it teaching courses and attending courses and so forth. Everybody comes up and says, "Okay, where did you have your hands?" No, no, no. That's not the special sauce. The special sauce
Yeah.
is put your hands on and then find out for yourself, right? And I think sometimes we get in these buckets of, we have this concept of, a specific modality being the end all be all. We paint ourselves into this corner of saying that we have to do A, B, and C this way to get the results. And it's like, okay, but how can we work smarter? How can we do different? Right? You know, there's so much. Everybody has a foundation that they build their stuff on, right? You know whether it's exercise, stretch, so forth. But it's the playing around with the intricacies of it that allow us to then blossom, right? It's using this pelvic program, which is a quote unquote women's health program, but the idea of, well, I've got a soccer player with a core injury. Well, the whole setup is we're going to be, you know, neutral pad on the lower rectus abdominis, okay, part of your core injury. We're going to have, if you got the back four, you're going to put one pad on each adductor, okay, also highly integrated in core injuries, and we're going to pass that current through the pubic symphysis. That's exactly what we need to look at when we're talking about a core injury, is though that pathway. And
Right.
it's like, oh well, you know maybe everybody else has figured it out. It just hasn't been one of those things that it was their best kept secret that they weren't telling anybody. But it was an aha moment for me when I was you know talking to a soccer athletic trainer about, hey, these are the things I want you to play with and see what your results are, because this is going to be hopefully be a meaningful, impactful way that you can go into your athletic training room after you're sitting in your athletic training room on this phone call. When we hang up, you go find that player that has this injury and try it
Mhm.
out, right? See if it does anything. See if it does. I'm gonna say, after the amount of stuff that I've done with those programs, my wife would, who's downstairs, would be more than happy to come up here and tell you how much she now calls it her magic machine, because she's got some low back issues, and I've treated her. She's standing at this very desk, as when she was grading her classes for the end of the semester, and I strapped the pads to her, and you know I
Yeah.
was out of town for the weekend, and I'm just kind of getting back into life at home, but she hasn't talked about having any back soreness in the last week, so something's
I
working.
feel that.
And
Yeah.
and other than exercise, that the only thing she's done is added the Winback. She's been doing exercises every day for months, so
Right.
you know that I
Okay.
we know she's feeling better.
Love that. Okay, as we get towards wrapping up, I want
Sure.
to shift to one final fun question for you.
Okay.
Do you have like a favorite, which will Laura Ramus is she's got all these crazy stories from her times in sort of the AT and the PT world with all these sports teams. Do you have a favorite athlete story that you can safely tell?
Oh, you know what, that one's, I don't know.
If not, I can give you a different rapid fire question.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, I mean, there's a lot of, I've always we always used to joke about writing a book and so forth, and can you do it? And there's all sorts of stuff that, what, that one's got me locked out. I can't answer that in a lightning round.
Okay, okay. All right. Well, in that case, how about Let's do then for kind of a final question. Is there one clinical hill you'll die on? Like, is there something where like, people that's controversial and you're like, no, I feel super strongly about this?
Oh, oh, yeah. Uh, you know what? I think the biggest one that I especially see in it was funny. I worked a team handball event this last weekend, and the amount of individuals that um, had blisters on their hands,
Okay.
and and the thing is treating blisters always is for me, it's always you debride the wound as far down as you can, because you want to increase that you want to get to the freshest, most viable tissue as quickly as possible. And along with that is I've had discussions back and forth, and the everybody says that you would debride that wound wet. That it's and what I found is I can't if you debride a blister or callus wet, it comes off in chunks. And I will die on the hill that I want them as dry as possible so that when I take a scalpel and I shave it down, that it comes off in pieces, not in chunks. And
That is really interesting. I actually totally agree with you on this. Like I also have a strong feeling about this.
yeah, it's one of those things like it's
You
one
got
of
to
those
dry it
things you get.
out.
It's one of those things like, yet again, I'm in a household with another athletic trainer, right? She teaches, and she's an incredible teacher. And, they teach with wound care, you debride when it's wet. And for me, for how finite I need to be with a pitcher's blister, hangnail, callus, for how finite I need to be, I can't take it off in chunks. I need it
Yeah.
dry. And like I said, everybody else, when they talk about healing or they talk about breeding a wound, it's always when it's wet. You get into, at some point in time, I got into a Twitter battle with somebody that, you
Oh
know,
God.
that's I think I can't remember if I started on him or he started on me, but that's the hill I'll die on. Is it has to be. I think wound healing needs to be wet unless I'm going to
Yeah.
then debride it, and then that needs
Well,
to
and
be
then I'm going to ask you because I think this is interesting to kind of play back into. I'm going to give a Winback a plug here because you kind of
sure.
mentioned you want to get to the healthy, the most viable tissue first. And with Winback, because you have that ability to change frequencies, you can take care of what you need to with the wound. If you can get that wound off and get down to that healthy tissue, then you can use the Winback to improve that tissue at the surface level and
Sure.
start to heal that tissue faster so that
Yes.
that pitcher or whether if they got it from batting or hitting,
Right.
whatever it is, that they're not out of the game because if they've got blisters that aren't healing.
Right. Yeah. It's that. Like I said, that's the hill I'll die on. Is that you debride that wound down to as best you can, and you start that healing as best as possible.
That is
Because,
that is not
because
something I would have thought you were going to say, but I love it. I love.
you know what, I think all the other hills, there, a lot of people are, have staked their claim and so forth. Like, exercise trumps everything. But the thing is we also know that you can augment it with the win back and so forth. So I could die on that. I could fight that hill, but I know that there's exceptions to the rule. For me, there's not an exception to that to that rule for skincare.
Sure. Okay. All right. One final question, which is what are you personally or professionally most excited about right now?
Oof. You know what? I think for me, it is making the impact with. I think right now for me is with the youth sports and creating. Like I said, my 11-year-old is little league, right? And so for me, it's it's making that impact with kids, right?
Love
You
that.
know, I've always said, I love working professional sports. One of the other spots that I'd always see myself working in is with, the tactical athlete. My dad was military. Working with that athlete has always been a big thing. And then youth sports, because you know I always I baseball has always kind of been, that on the fringe of things. Like, I see it. Every hockey coach has to have a certification, right? Every hockey coach has to present their card to the referees before they start the game to say they are a certified coach. And
Right.
baseball has nothing in that. Like, I know to be a little league coach, so forth, you have to go through some steps, but it's not to the point where there is a standardized, this is what you have to do to be an affiliated coach in baseball. To be a USA Baseball approved coach, you have to go through this step, this step, this step, this step. And if you want to do another hill I'll die on, is that every coach needs to have some sort of a certification. And that's every sport. Like I said, I, for the most part, live in the baseball world, but every sport, and like hockey does it right because they have their coaches with certifications.
Right.
So I guess that's probably the other hill that I would die on, is that until
Cool.
we do that, we're gonna continue with our youth injury epidemic until we get everybody on the same page in some regard.
Yeah, I really agree with you. I think that's important, is that, kids, yeah, I mean, pretty much when you're a kid, anybody, somebody's dad, whatever, can be your coach. And you've got to have some basic understanding of what can happen to you in that sport. So
Right.
that's a really good hill to die on, and a cool thing for you to be excited about personally as well. Mark, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your experience and your perspective. I really
No,
think
thank you.
I think conversations like this really help people to understand the human side of both the sports medicine, performance and recovery, but also like the relationships, the trust, and like the evolution of the care that you have with your athletes. And for me personally, it's just really cool because we have this really wonderful team in our academy here in the US, but I want to make sure that everybody knows who we are. And people like yourself, you come from these amazing backgrounds, and now we're getting the opportunity and really have the chance to work with you, which is fantastic and exciting. But it is because of who the career that you built for yourself and the work that you've done. So
Well,
to kind of
thank you.
wrap it
Yeah.
up, yeah, if you have anything else that you wanted to add, but just thank
No,
you.
no, I want to thank you for the opportunity. It's a great opportunity to just have that conversation of, what sports, what high level sports involves, and what it, where the kind of the fringes are, and kind of what we can kind of where we can interject into those fringes to help with our athletes, help get them better, to do what we can as, as therapists, as athletic trainers, as individuals that are trying to help high level athletes and everyday athletes and youth and the kids, youth athletes. And I applaud you, applaud Winback and so forth for, doing bringing in the therapists to allow us to kind of talk about what our loves are, and kind of letting us, kind of show the hills we want to die on.
Heck yeah. No, thank you for being part of our team. And thank you to everyone listening to this Ambassador Spotlight episode of the Winback Academy podcast. We'll see you next time.